Talk Africa, leaders of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, are meeting here in Washington, D.C. to commemorate 75 years of the alliance. The summit is set to address pressing global challenges and pledge new military and economic support for Ukraine. What have been NATO's milestones over the decades? What nature of relationship exists between the military alliance and the African Union? Straight Talk Africa starts right now. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa, coming to you from VOA headquarters here in Washington. I'm Vincent Makori. U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday welcomed NATO leaders and heralded the alliance's 75th anniversary while making the case for peace through strength amid the largest challenge to peace in Europe that Europe has faced in decades. Other administration officials made similar arguments for bolstering defense to fight global threats. A VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from Washington.
President Joe Biden made a forceful case for peace through strength as NATO members gathered Tuesday in Washington to mark the 75th anniversary of the Security Alliance as it faces what may be the biggest test in its history.
It's good that we're stronger than ever because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues. And Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine. But make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
His argument was bolstered by other members of his administration on Tuesday, with his national security advisor speaking to defense industry executives and invoking a Roman adage: if you want peace, prepare for war. And the alliance's chief began making his pitch, literally and rhetorically, right after landing in Washington.
Great pitch!
Sign a new defense industrial pledge. And that will be a pledge that will help to make our industry across Europe and North America stronger, more innovative, and capable of producing at scale.
Biden, in his remarks, acknowledged Stoltenberg's role in the alliance by surprising the former Norwegian Prime Minister with the U.S.'s top civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
I keep seeing all those stories.
But analysts ask whether this show of presidential power at the summit can obscure Biden's obvious political troubles at home, after a poor debate showing led to mounting calls for him to leave November's presidential race.
It should remind us of the criticality of American leadership of this alliance. It is an American creation. It survives and prospers and thrives and has thriven on American leadership. And when doubts arise about American leadership and American leaders, the alliance, when the American president catches a cold, NATO gets pneumonia.
It's a sobering thought as NATO meets under the hospitality of an embattled American president, that his weakness, and likewise his strength, are contagious. Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
Well, thank you, Anita, for that report. For more, we turn to VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, who joins us from the venue of the NATO summit in Washington. Hi, Carla. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Now, give us some highlights of today's meetings.
Well, today is going to be all about Ukraine. President Zelensky has come to Washington and he has told reporters that he is looking for more commitments for F-16s and he is looking for more commitments for air defense. As we heard President Joe Biden announce last night, he is getting some of those commitments for air defense. President Biden said that there would be 5 air defense systems heading to Ukraine, 1 Patriot from the United States that had not been previously announced, and that in the coming months, additional air defense systems would be rolling into Ukraine. That is a big check for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, although he had asked for at least 7 of these air defense systems, so he did not get everything on his list, but definitely coming back to his country with additional firepower to defend his country. We are looking for what's going to happen with F-16s. We were told last year that the NATO and the United States would be committing F-16 training and F-16 fighter jets to help Ukraine in their fight. It's been a year now, and VOA has reported that we expect those jets to arrive in Ukraine by this summer. We will see if they are going to reaffirm that and give us some more details about just how many jets Ukraine is ready to receive. And the big thing that NATO is trying to organize here is they are trying to commit money for next year. So if leadership changes in one of the big NATO nations like the United States, they will still have a commitment to supply Ukraine with funding and military support. They're looking for about 40 billion euros to provide for Ukraine next year.
And we know that the former President Trump had always, insisted that the NATO allies need to spend a bit more, at least 2% of their GDP more, so that it comes to about 4%. So far, what is known in terms of how much they've upped their game in terms of spending a bit more so that it's not just falling on the shoulders of the United States?
That's right. Well, actually, it should be pointed out, I know President Trump said that the European allies needed to spend more. The European allies are actually spending more than the United States per GDP. There's many countries that are spending a lot more than the United States is spending. So there has been burden sharing. But the interesting thing, and a highlight of the NATO summit this week, is that 23 of the 32 nations have committed and delivered on spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. That was a huge goal that was set actually before Presidents Biden and President Trump. It was set back in the Wells Summit in 2014. They said by 2024 they would be there, and most of the allies have done that. And that is something that President Biden's team is talking about today. They said, look at the spending. And they compare Trump with Biden, and they say, President Trump was able to increase NATO allies in their spending by $70 billion, but during the Biden administration, they increased by about $180 billion, all the NATO allies outside of the United States. So they say that they've been able to increase spending even more. I will caution and say that there is another person that should also be included in this conversation. It's not necessarily which president of the United States is leading that country, that NATO member. It's been about Vladimir Putin. When you look at the spending, there was a steady increase of spending of about $10 billion each year until Russia invaded Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, that's when NATO allies really upped their spending, and they've done so for the past 2.5 years.
Well, Carla, thank you very much for your excellent reporting. That's Carla Babb, who is a VOA Pentagon correspondent, coming to us live from Washington. Now, for more perspective on NATO's milestones, its future and its relationship with Africa, we're hoping to be joined by Kwaku Nuama, who is a professor at the School of International Service, American University, and right here in Washington. Also, we're joined by Jason C. Moyer. He's a program associate, Global Europe Program at the Wilson Center. He's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Jason, welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Yes. Now, the meeting started with the president's speech, of course, and there's been a lot of talk about reassuring the allies. Now, why has this been critical, especially when this is happening right here in Washington, 75th anniversary of NATO?
There's a lot of attention being paid to this current NATO summit, in part due to the number of elections taking place across the United States, across Europe. There's concerns about continued allied unity for Ukraine. This is not just an opportunity to celebrate the tremendous milestones of NATO. There's a lot of real work to be done. There's a kinetic war happening on Europe's border, on its front doorstep, and it's more important than ever for NATO allies to come together, both in support of Ukraine and to look ahead to its future mission. There's been a lot of talk of the next 75 years of NATO and what the alliance will look like from moving forward.
Now, we did actually mention, partially from a reporter right at the convention center at the venue of the summit, that, previously former President Putin had said, former President Trump had insisted that the European allies need to spend at least 2% more of their defense budget on NATO, and it looks like some of them really did increase their spending. But then at the same time, you feel like there are jitters running through the spines of some allies and some others whenever they think of the prospect of President Trump coming back. Why is that so?
Well, I think if you look back at the last several administrations, there have been a number of concerns about NATO allies spending enough. As your colleague mentioned, 23 out of 32 NATO allies are going to hit that 2% threshold. There's even been talks of this 2% no longer being a ceiling, but being a floor, which just shows how many European countries are so committed now to defense spending in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But really, this burden sharing question is not new. It's been around for multiple administrations. The Trump administration was really kind of the first that very, very strongly pushed for European allies to spend more. And sure enough, there was actually more NATO allies committing to spending the 2% threshold under his presidency. Then the Russian war against Ukraine began in earnest in 2022, and that led to another wave of countries spending more. So, yeah, very much burden sharing remains kind of a key point for the alliance.
So other than just the push for spending a bit more, is there any other concerns of a change of administration in the U.S. as regards the future of NATO?
When I speak to European colleagues and counterparts, they are very concerned about what a potential Trump administration would look like and what that means for NATO. I warn them that often we don't know what exactly will take place. We don't know Trump's kind of real policies when it comes to NATO. There's been a lot of confusion. A lot of the people that claim to be close to the former president have been speaking on his behalf on all things NATO. We don't know what will actually transpire in the fall. We don't know what from this campaign trail will become policy if President Trump does return to the White House. So I've been urging caution. I've been urging, very much for people just to kind of take things with a grain of salt at this stage. And we have to see what happens in the fall with the election.
And now going over to Europe, we know that one of the key discussion is the push to increase the help, or at least the security package for Ukraine. Is that looking like it's going to act in any fashion as a deterrent, given how much money has already been spent in trying to help Ukraine push back against the invasion by Russia?
This plan for NATO to take more of an active role in providing support for Ukraine was first floated a few months ago. There was talk then of a €100 billion fund that would basically make NATO kind of more directly involved for supporting Ukraine and providing weapons. Previously, up until now, the U.S. has been kind of the primary driver through an American military installation in Wiesbaden, Germany. We'll have to see the results of the summit. They're really just kicking off today. There's going to be extensive discussions today and tomorrow, and we fully expect that there will be some kind of announcement about the future of NATO's role in supporting Ukraine.
Yes. And now Professor Nuama is joining us via phone. That is Kwaku Nuama, who's a professor at School of International Studies, International Service, American University. Professor Nuama, welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Thanks for having me, Vincent.
Yes. Now, if you followed a little bit of the conversation, we're getting to the discussion over the security of Ukraine and the discussions at the NATO summit. We know that the question of ceasefire talks, with Russia have been a little, not really moving forward. Russia has made it very clear that it wants Ukraine to cede the territories Russia has invaded. That includes Donetsk, Lugansk People's Republic, and even Kherson and some other territory, for even a ceasefire, conversation over a ceasefire to happen. That also Russia wants Ukraine to completely declare that it's not going to join NATO. Now, how does that play in terms of the future of any peaceful resolution to the problem, the issue between Russia and Ukraine?
So two things. I think if Russia is trying to dissuade Ukraine from joining NATO, it's going about it the wrong way, because the more you threaten the country, the more likely it is that they will seek these kinds of security alliances. The other thing is, if Russia is trying to acquire territory, There are different ways of doing it. And international law prohibits these kinds of approaches to acquisition of territory. And part of the reason why Russia is dealing with coming up with these issues is because you have ethnic Russians stuck in these territories, and part of these kinds of irredentist conflicts is the legacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They're going to need a better way for managing that collapse than the use of force, which is not going very well for them. I think that it threatens the entire post-World War II collective security architecture.
Yes. So it looks like the positions that Russia has put on the table are quite quite major, talking about Ukraine, in fact, ceding all those lands. That means Russia basically occupying those lands. And also the whole question of Russia, Ukraine rejecting to join NATO, when actually Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says that the final negotiations are over the language close to be finalized. So how does this even work? But before you give me the response to that question, gentlemen, we want to take a short break right now. And when we come back, we'll continue our discussion about NATO, whose leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. this week. Stay with us.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
African governments are wrestling with rising food prices, gas shortages, as well as other economic challenges. Many non-governmental organizations are having to increase their effort in supporting the vulnerable in society. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we'll hear what is being done by Africans for Africans to curb hunger and malnutrition and the women behind the work. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
Welcome back. We are talking about NATO, its milestones over the decades, and what nature of relationship exists between the military alliance and the African Union. I'm with Kwaku Nuama, professor at School of International Service, American University, and Jason C. Moyer, program associate, Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. So before we went to break, I wanted to get some response on the conditions that Russia puts on the table for any semblance of talks or even a ceasefire. And it says, first, Ukraine has to clearly state that it rejects any efforts or any moves to have it join NATO, and also that it has to accept to cede the lands that have been invaded. Now, if I may get your thoughts first, Jason, really, is there a prospect of Russia budging on these demands, or just even just backing down?
I don't see Russia backing down. Ultimately, Russia began this conflict, and they can end this conflict at any time. It's fully within their power. If you look back, I mean, trying to negotiate with Russia is incredibly difficult. If you look back over the 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea, there were multiple attempts to create some kind of agreement between Ukraine and Russia. This was known as the Minsk Accords. These failed ultimately, in part because Russia as a country is not interested in negotiating. It sees itself as coming from a place of power. It sees itself as coming from a place where it doesn't have to give up anything. And this makes it incredibly difficult to negotiate with Russia. And it's very unlikely that this current conflict in Ukraine will end in any kind of meaningful agreement anytime soon. It's ultimately up to Ukraine. Ukraine will really have to kind of it has already set the terms. It has claimed that it wants full territorial integrity, and we have to respect that decision.
Mm-hmm. Professor Nuama, you know, someone else has come into play here. That's China, working very closely with Russia. That has become quite of concern. Is this the biggest challenge, perhaps, that NATO is facing since its creation 75 years ago? The expansion of the threat.
It could be, but I don't think that the Chinese are reckless. I think that they would support Vladimir Putin within reason, but I don't see them getting in on the action. Same with India. Yes, you can get some kind of support, either economic or diplomatic, but I can't see them going to Russia's aid in terms of when this becomes a confrontation with NATO. But I don't think that the Chinese are not that reckless, and I think that this stuff is going to be decided within the confines of what NATO is willing to do in terms of raising the cost of cooperation for the Russians. The Ukrainians are being blackmailed. Unfortunately, that's a game, and they're going to take this deal that Putin is offering if and when the United States walks away from this confrontation in terms of supporting them. They're going to take a deal, even though it's bad, if it's the best deal they can get compared to what they can get unilaterally. And so that's the thing. The question is, for how long can we keep supporting them? For how long can the United States keep bearing their burden? Because NATO essentially is the United States. So if and when that support declines, they may be forced to consider that deal. Mm-hmm.
And Jason, you know, there is also in this summit in Washington, one of the other aspects of the summit is actually the expansion of NATO's partnerships now with the Indo-Pacific nations. How does this kind of sink in with the original objectives of NATO, and why is this important at this time?
Absolutely. If you talk to folks at NATO headquarters, they will say that NATO is a North Atlantic organization. It doesn't have any business operating in the Indo-Pacific, but increasingly there have been calls by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by France, countries with long histories of being active in the Indo-Pacific, for NATO to have more of a role in the region. There was a lot of discussion about NATO opening a civilian liaison office in Tokyo, and this kind of brought forward some of these questions of to what extent NATO will play a role in the Indo-Pacific. For the last several NATO summits, the AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4, that's New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, have been invited to the NATO summit, which increasingly shows that there is, you know, this kind of look at NATO's role in the region, and they want to encourage strong partnerships and strong alliances. We've had both AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US nuclear submarine sharing arrangement, also kind of has more of an Indo-Pacific tilt, and even though it's not formally part of NATO, this is kind of, you're seeing increasing ties between the Indo-Pacific and the Atlantic.
Yes. Professor Nuama, now that you're talking about expanding of partnerships, way back in 2005, NATO reached some agreement with the African Union to sort of be supporting the AU on different fronts, including logistics and also cooperating in areas that they would find of mutual interest. Now, in your studies, in your observation over the years, have you seen that happening, and how substantial has that been?
Oh, absolutely. And so NATO has been involved with the African Union primarily since about 2005. They've done operational support, work training support for African Union troops, structural assistance for example, the African Standby Force. They now have an office in Addis, and they are working with the African Union significantly going forward. The thing is that NATO is realizing that they have to address the structural sources of conflict beyond, the initial threat that they were confronted with in Europe. And, as part of those structural sources includes problems in the periphery. So if there are problems in Africa, for example, it fuels migration into Europe, and that creates problems for NATO countries over there. So they have to look beyond their initial mission and try and help countries in the periphery. And we also catch a lot of the hell that NATO policies create. And so NATO, for example, is directly linked to the final blow that toppled Libya, the Gaddafi regime, that led to all these Tuareg fighters moving into Mali, destabilizing the area. Even in a way, the problem in Sudan can be traced back to Libya, which then brings us back to NATO. So we expect NATO to be stepping up and helping us deal with these problems. And they have, to their credit, they have. They are helping build capacity in the periphery. And in the African case, it's a very welcome assistance.
Yes. And Jason, as we get closer to the end of the show, locally, actually, there's been a lot of debate over how much the U.S. has spent, especially on Ukraine. And we know there's also some spending in the Middle East. Can this become a critical issue, or is it in the upcoming elections? Some may feel like there's too much spending already.
Well, if I can just emphasize a great point made by Professor Nuama, the interconnectedness between security across the world. Something that happens in Europe is a direct security interest for the United States. So really, this dates back to several world wars. This goes back to the entirety of the Cold War. The United States continues to have an interest in security and peace in Europe, and really this kind of comes from a long legacy of the shaping of the international order following World War II. So really, this question of continued U.S. commitment and continued U.S. spending on European defense, I think there is an inherent understanding that European security is closely linked to United States security.
Kwaku, just your thoughts on what I said in terms of the influence it can have, spending outside, what influence it can have in the upcoming elections.
I absolutely agree with Jason. The thing is, the United States, the government has to make the case that investment in NATO, particularly pushing back Russia, is investment in American security. And this is a small price to pay to have the deterrent value of NATO. And so, this is not something that the United States is doing for Ukraine. Primarily Ukraine is benefiting, but it benefits the United States, and it benefits all of us, because we are all beneficiaries of a stable, clear security system. And NATO is the tip of that spear, which has kept the world mostly, major conflict-free for 75 years. I know there's been skirmishes here and there, and people have died and all that stuff, but think about what would have happened if you didn't have NATO. We could have really destroyed our planet.
Thank you.
So this is a good way to spend money.
Well, we'll have to leave it right here. Thank you both for being on the show. Kwaku Nuama is professor at School of International Service at American University, and Jason Moyer, Program Associate, Global Europe Program at the Wilson Center. Thanks to our affiliate stations for broadcasting Straight Talk Africa across the continent. I'll see you next time.